Welcome to America's finest fantasy football podcast. It was like that sort of caught me by surprise, even though we'd been counting down toward it. It was like, hey, here we're live. Eddie Brown, Union-Tribune's fantasy expert. You know him because you read him. Kevin Acee, sports columnist, and I'm learning fantasy football. That's why I'm so excited to be here with you. Eddie Brown is making me, in my first year doing fantasy football, a better fantasy football player. But Eddie, I need your advice more than ever. And so does everybody else, because this was a week of monster injuries. I'm sure it could have been worse. And we can talk about Julio Jones, though he'll be back after the Falcons have a bye. But Chris Carson, this running back that everybody picks up, I had him.
Right.
That's most important. Everybody picks up because he had become Seattle's number one, basically, running back, and there have been other injuries to running backs. Two quarterbacks, Derek Carr, Marcus Mariota, down on the same day for the second straight year. Now, not long term, but they're going to be out a while. Right. Eddie, start wherever you want to. How do people make up for this?
It's tough. We started the season. David Johnson goes down, so you have a bunch of teams, a bunch of owners scrambling. This week, though, it's tougher because you don't just have one big player go down. You have kind of a lot of good players that are going to touch a lot of different teams. If you're like me, I have one team that had Dalvin Cook and Chris Carson replacing David Johnson. so that takes you a step further.
That was a rough Sunday, Eddie
It's
Brown.
A very tough Sunday. Lost a really close matchup,
I
too.
forgot to mention Dalvin Cook. He had become one of your top fantasy football running backs. And, we did a story on Pro Football Doc, a post, obviously, right away. Dr. Chow nailed it right away. It was ACL. Blew up. Obviously, because so many fantasy owners.
Yeah, Dr. Chow, best in the biz.
Real.
But yeah, Cook, definitely he was one of those guys that you probably drafted. If you did draft David Johnson, you probably came back and got Cook in the third round. You targeted Kareem Hunt, Dalvin Cook, those rookie guys, Leonard Fournette, in hopes that you could pair them with a guy like David Johnson, Ezekiel Elliott, or LaShawn McCoy, and to have him go down a month into the season is a heartbreaker. A lot of these guys, like you said, him and Carson are probably the hardest ones to deal with because running back is just so weak on the waiver wire at this point. There's very slim pickings, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But, fortunately, like you said, with Derek Carr and Marcus Mariota, they won't be out for the season, so you might have them back, although their injuries are kind of those types of injuries that linger. The big name on the list, Julio Jones, I have a feeling he'll be fine. And also, he tends to play with injuries all the time anyways.
And buys start, which starts to complicate your fantasy football lineups, but good in this case. You were going to miss Julio Jones anyway probably this week.
Perfect timing.
Have a bye.
Perfect timing. Normally you don't – it's not the happiest time of year when buys start hitting. Usually that's when you're missing guys. But if you do happen to have Julio Jones, you were going to miss a week anyways. Gives him a chance to rest, and you're not going to miss any points.
Let's talk about a guy who I think maybe, Eddie, you were close to giving up on, and probably a lot of fantasy owners were going, wait a minute, this guy's supposed to be running for touchdowns, throwing for touchdowns. His weapons are going down left and right on the Panthers. Cam Newton, and boom, not only a real win in real life, but comes through in fantasy.
Vintage. He was, 22, 29, 316 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. He ran for 44 yards and a touchdown. That's the Superman that we remember, from a couple of years ago, led him all the way to the Super Bowl. Seriously, 1 week away from saying, hey, you can drop this guy. Just because of all the factors. He's coming off an injury. He looked like he had a lot of rust on him. Lost a lot of his major weapons. Everything was looking really bad. But as we'll notice, might be a trend this year. The Patriots came to town and everything was made better.
Yeah, weird. Well, let's talk about that. How the Patriots and the Patriots, after what they did to the Saints in week 2, were like, well, of course. That was the easiest game to call ever. Like if you had a survivor pool, right? You get the Saints out of here, right? But since then, what happened? Lindsay Lohan and Jamie Lee Curtis. I'm not going back to the original with, I forget their names. But anyway, right. Freaky Friday, baby.
Freaky Friday. Last year, if you had any players on your roster that were facing the Saints, you started them. You just didn't ask questions. That defense was horrible. It gave up all the yards, all the touchdowns.
And it made Tom Brady and the Patriots in week 2 this year.
Week 2. And then all of a sudden, they're playing, like you said, they're playing solid the last couple of weeks after they faced the Patriots. The Patriots, this entire season, from the beginning with Kareem Hunt and then against the Saints, And now last week against Newton, I mean they've given up a 300-yard passer in every single game. I mean, which is unheard of. Belichick must not be sleeping at all.
Have you faced a time like this though, where maybe you have the Patriots defense or you have other weapons on the Patriots, and do you, as a fantasy, general manager, do you give issues with a Bill Belichick coached team more time to work out than say another team?
I personally do. I mean, at this point, he has a certain cachet. So
yeah, he's kind of earned that.
Yeah, he's kind of earned that. And so I personally did have the Patriots on one of my teams this year. I have, yet to drop them. I probably will pretty soon. Just because you can only give him so much benefit of the doubt before, like I said, they're giving up 32 points a game. Their quarterbacks are throwing all over them. It doesn't matter who it is. So at this point, with their offense, you can expect a bunch of high-scoring affairs, and it's kind of really hard to wait on him, especially when there's some decent defenses out there on the wire.
Moving on here on the America's Finest Fantasy Football Podcast, Eddie Brown, Eddie, tell the folks on Tuesdays and Thursdays, your columns drop. They shoot right to the top of what's trending on the Union-Tribune website. On Tuesday at 11 a.m.
It's ad drop.
Thursday at 11 a.m.
Start and sit.
And those are Pacific time.
Yes.
Because this is the World Wide Web. All sorts of time zones we're dealing with.
Yeah, we're everywhere.
Okay. Now, look, Richard Sherman's going to get mad at me here because I might be dehumanizing a couple Raiders here. Derek Carr goes down. I don't know with what's going on with Amari Cooper. I mean, is that the worst news in the world? Let's talk about, I don't mean to. Look, it is. I hate to make light of injuries or anything like that. But the fact is, the Raiders aren't giving you what you thought they were going to give you offensively.
No, definitely. And the irony, though, is, Cooper may have never been Derek Carr's favorite target in the first place.
Crabtree.
Yeah.
Who's been hurt.
So this actually, Cooper's kind of replaced Cam Newton, on the list of, well, is he droppable? Is he droppable? I mean, everybody's waiting for him to have a breakout year. He's 3-4 years into it. By now, he should be a top 5 receiver, but he's not. He's not even his quarterback's favorite receiver. But the talent is inescapable. You can't deny it. So at this point, if they're facing a tough schedule, he has E.J. Manuel as his quarterback. That could be the best thing that's ever happened to him. Or he could continue to descend down the rankings, and maybe in 2 weeks you find yourself either unloading him for 50 cents on the dollar, or dropping him entirely, or just banishing him to your bench.
I'd banish him to my bench, and I'm 2-2 in my league, Eddie.
Yeah, that's fair.
I mean, I just want you to know that I'm 2-2. So I'm not 0-4.
It's not a bad place to be.
I feel like you thought maybe I was 0-4.
No.
Okay. I mentioned Richard Sherman, and I do love when we do this, Eddie, because you're hardcore fantasy, and quite honestly, I came from a place where covering the league every day, I sometimes would maybe, and I've fallen in love with fantasy. It's changed the way I watch the game, I kind of look down on it a little bit, Eddie, if I just to simplify it, in that you guys are simplifying the game too much. And then you see these things on Twitter and people getting mad, and then people would ask me for advice, and I didn't know fantasy, and then they get mad at me because I lost the money, all this stuff. So whatever. Let's forget all that. I'm a huge fantasy guy now. Richard Sherman, Seahawks cornerback, says that fantasy football has dehumanized people. It has made them less sensitive, callous, to injured players, because that's all that people care about. What say you, Eddie?
Well, I played fantasy football since 1997, so we're 20 years in. I've been a football fan, a cognitive football fan, since 1987.
You watch college, you watch NFL, you do our draft stuff, which is spot on always.
Well, thank you very much.
You're into both.
Yeah, I've been since I was a kid. Since I was a kid.
Once you stopped playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, well, I did like a Star Wars version of Dungeons and Dragons, but we'll get into that later. So yeah, once I did that, it was football nonstop, 24/7. I was a full fan for a decade before I discovered fantasy sports. I would think that this is a case of Richard either giving us fans not enough credit or too much credit. Okay. Because as a fan, I mean, isn't it the NFL that kind of fostered the idea of next man up? So as a fan, I don't think we were prepared to necessarily get into their personal business after they're off the field. Once you're off the field, I'm focused on who's helping my team. right? I grew up in Northern California. I grew up a 49ers fan. When Joe Montana got hurt, I mean, yeah, he's my hero. I hope he comes back, but I don't know what he's doing in the rehab room when he's not on the field. I'm all of a sudden focused on Steve Young. When Steve Young gets hurt, I'm focused on Steve Bono. Do I lament their injury? Yeah, I hope they get better. I think about them, but not really on a personal level. I don't think fantasy sports changed that. It hurts me now more a little bit. I'm a little bit more invested, but that's just fandom.
Yes, it is fandom, and also it's Twitter, Rich. I mean, it's first of all 140 characters, and look, the guy who used to be on the couch saying these things like, that bum got hurt, well, my fantasy team's screwed. Well, now he's saying it on Twitter, so we see it. Let's not give it too much importance, would be my thing. Plus, and I know you feel this way, Eddie, you make as much money as you do, Richard Sherman, because of fantasy football.
I mean, definitely.
I'm not saying it's all about money.
No.
I think Richard's a great guy and is going to do great things after football. He's one of those guys.
Right.
But, come on.
Yeah, I mean, people are following you. Your brand, quote unquote, is getting better because of fantasy sports. If somebody happens to tweet at you, oh, you lost, Chris Carson lost my matchup because you went down, you got hurt. It's not because he hates Chris Carson or anything like that. Like you said, he's just now he has a louder microphone to yell into, and really all you're doing by talking about it is amplifying it.
True, giving more power to the trolls.
That's it.
And the truth is, in Richard Sherman's defense, or to agree with Richard Sherman, maybe that guy is a jerk.
Sure.
Who said that? But like you said, maybe he didn't mean that. And here's what Richard Sherman said. I think a lot of people, a lot of fans out there have looked at players even less like people because of fantasy football and things like that. You go and say, oh, man, this guy got hurt. You're not thinking, hey, man, this guy got hurt. He's really physically hurt, and he's going to take time to recover, and it's probably going to affect his mental state and his physical state. Now he has a long, rigorous rehab. You're thinking, oh, man, he's messing up my fantasy team. That's what Richard Sherman said. And you know what? I believe he has a point, but I also think,
yeah,
everything that we just talked about.
Yeah, exactly. You're right, Richard. But at the same point, to use a phrase that the kids are using nowadays, it's just not that deep. I don't think fans get that deep into it. Yeah, it sucks that my favorite running back is hurt, but let's once again, next man up.
Which coaches invented, by the way. And players will spout to you anytime.
Really?
But let's not give them too much credit there. We talked about the Patriots and maybe being patient with them, all right? But here's the thing, Eddie. We've reached the quarter point of the season, and we're even further than that in fantasy football because the playoffs for fantasy football begin, week 15, 16?
So it depends on your league, but week 14 usually for standard leagues.
So we're like a third of the way through the fantasy football.
Right.
It's time to be making some hard decisions here. What's your strategy on right now? Buys are starting. We're reaching a really important point of the season where you might be very close to already being out of it.
Right.
What's your strategy?
Well,
now, you got 4 leagues, by the way.
Right. We've talked about, I'm in 4 leagues. I am actually in a weird place where I have a 4-0 team, I have a 3-1 team, I have a 2-2 team, and I have a 1-3 team. So it's all over the spectrum. If you're the 1-3 team, that's been my unluckiest team, I'd like to say. Literally,
of course.
It's luck. It's luck. It's luck.
All right, North.
Right. Faced off against Kareem Hunt the first week. I won't really go into it. I'm just saying. Anyways, we're fresh off the first victory, but it's one of those things to where I actually renamed the team once. Want to give it a little better mojo, so I renamed the team after an 0-3 start.
Does that work?
It worked. I got my win.
Okay.
So I renamed it in Aaron Rodgers' honor. Relax, RELAX. So just but see, that's me letting my league mates know, hey, I'm not out of this.
Ooh, in case you want to do a trade with them, you're not desperate.
Yeah, I'm not desperate.
Chill.
We're not over. It's 1-3. At this point, though, I do recalibrate my expectations. So what do you need to get in the playoffs? Maybe I'm not going to win the division at 1-3, but a 500 record usually gets you in the playoffs. Usually you're competing for the final spot. And that's really all you need, especially if you're peaking at the right time. So at this point, if you're 1-3, make sure. I mean, that's the team that I made a trade in. I traded Jay Ajayi last week because I needed wide receiver help. I'm making moves. I'm a little bit more active because it's one of those things where the ship's going down. I'm not going to let it go down.
So in the 3-1 and the 4-0, right? Mm-hmm. No luck involved there. All skill.
No, that's all skill.
Do you Do you go status quo, or you're just as diligent with those teams?
The one time that I'm scared as a fantasy owner is when I think the team is fine. Like anytime, like I always like to have 2 spots on the roster where I'm constantly fidgeting. I'm constantly, on the wire picking up guys. I'm constantly thinking, well, can I move these guys so I can pick up this guy on the waiver wire that I really like? The 4-0 team scares me because right now it's a juggernaut. It's like I should leave it alone. But that worries me because I don't want to fall in love with my 4th running back and it keep me from picking up that player that's potentially going to help me down the road.
What you described there, the constant fidgeting, at least in thinking about it and doing these exercises and knowing that what could be around the corner might not be good, that's like a real life general manager too. It really is.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's something you have to constantly retool your roster. You got to make sure that there's always going to be injuries. I'm starting sit comes out on Thursday. My lead is injuries happen, right? They do. They happen in real football. They happen. They have the same effect on your fantasy team. But you have to move on. My 2-2 team, like I said, I drafted David Johnson. He's gone the first week. Well, I felt fortunate. I have Dalvin Cook. He gets off to a really good start. I pick up Chris Carson. I'm happy. Now I got 2 running backs back. I'm back to square one since I lost David Johnson. Both those guys go down in the same week. So I'm in a situation where I'm 2-2, and I'm having to hit the waiver wire hard. And I only have really 2 running backs on my roster at this point. So, that's something that, I'm not, the 2-2 team's not giving up.
But there just might not be that many running backs out there anymore.
It might not be. So if I can't answer that question on the waiver wire, then it might be time to start hitting up the other owners.
All right, we're probably past the point where people have rated the waiver wire in their leagues. But real quick, let's talk about a couple of the ads that are in your column. Just hit me with the highlights of, we talked about, you could probably do without replacing Julio Jones this week because it was a bye anyway, and he's going to be back the week after that.
Sure.
But running backs, Eddie, where do you look?
There, like you said, it's been combed over, but there are still a handful of guys with some serious potential. I think about Alvin Kamara. He's a rookie running back for the Saints, especially in PPR leagues. Sean Payton has shown that he's almost kind of man crush on the kid. He had over 10 targets. He had 10 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown. That's impressive. He has that spot locked down. So it's between Mark Ingram and Adrian Peterson, i.e. Mark Ingram, for the other spot. But Kamara, if you're in a PPR league, he's a great ad. Wayne Gallman in the Giants. Paul Perkins has been terrible. He hurt his shoulder last week. He hasn't been a fan of the coaching staff in New York. Gallman is a rookie out of Clemson, was very productive, and actually Clemson and the Giants kind of share the same spread offense philosophy, so he kind of fits the offense day one. I think they've been really happy with him. He finally got a chance last week. Very efficient, 40 yards, 10 carries, and he even caught a touchdown. They're still not going to run the ball as much as they should, but he's somebody, if you're like me and you lost 3 guys already, why not pick him up and get something?
Now, in my league, Wendell Smallwood was still available. I think that it was in my brain somewhere that you mentioned last week.
Yep.
Maybe he would be a good ad because Darren Sproles had gone down. So, and that was proved out. Had a good game against the Chargers, albeit against the Chargers on Sunday. But I picked up Wendell Smallwood because I had Chris Carson. So
yeah, no, that was great. That was a great
pick.
Yeah, no, it was a great pickup and definitely one of our ads last week. He's in a good situation because of Sproles being out. Blunt's going to be the goal line guy, but he's pretty much going to handle everything else. And that's going forward. And that's a pretty solid offense, too. I like Carson Wentz in that offense as well.
You are over all day. You are over Adrian Peterson. He's owned in 98% of ESPN leagues. He's got to be on a lot of people's bench, of course. But is that because they just can't think to themselves, I can't get rid of him. I can't get rid of AD.
Nostalgia is strong. Yeah. And also, especially for somebody like Adrian Peterson, he was a cyborg not too long ago. He literally came back from an ACL tear in like 4 months. He came back the following year and he almost broke the rushing record. No one does this type of stuff. I believe Dr. James Andrews said that when he opened up Peterson's knee, he was like, it's the greatest human knee I've ever seen. Like literally, like he looked inside and he was like, this is, technically perfect, except for the tear that I'm about to
And
face.
he's seen a lot.
And he's seen all the knees, essentially. So, you know, you have somebody that's at some time, at some point, was one of the greatest players of all time. And now he's in a situation where he doesn't fit the offense and he's not getting opportunities. And that's a death knell in fantasy. And like you said, he's still owned in almost 100% of leagues. That doesn't make any sense at this point. I mean, if you want to bench him and you have the depth to do that and you can just hold him on your league and hopefully he'll get that one play late in the season that helps you out, hey, you know, good managing. But if not, if you need other help and you need to get out there and shop on the waiver wire, feel free, let him go.
All right. Eddie Brown, give him the Twitter, Eddie. Where do they find you, Eddie?
At UT Eddie Brown.
And I just you got to follow Eddie because I'm serious. People are reading the heck out of your fantasy stuff online. Got to follow Eddie on the Twitter. He's helped out my team. I'd probably be 0-4 without him.
I answer all questions.
I can give you is I'm 500, and exactly he gets back to people. Unlike me, it's tough. Here's the deal. I've got to point this out. You are the first fantasy expert in the history of fantasy football. I'm quite certain to say start Andy Dalton.
There's a first for everything.
Yeah, so you nailed it.
Well, I'd like to thank the Cleveland Browns.
And that's it. You're huge, like all good fantasy players, on matchups.
Yes, they changed the offense coordinator the week before. He was solid. He didn't embarrass himself. His history against Cleveland is fantastic. It's probably the best team. His numbers against Cleveland is probably the best numbers he has against any team in football. It looked like a good matchup, and I trusted him. I even started him in a league where I had Marcus Mariota. That really worked out.
Wow.
So, and early on, I was scared because Mariota had run for 2 touchdowns, and it was really close. It was like, what am I doing here? But it worked out, and it's one of those things to where it was a solid matchup, and he's somebody that I think going forward you can play the matchups with.
You had a lot of good ones last week. One of them we would be completely remiss, even though it's so obvious. You said to start Deshaun Watson.
Yeah, once again, and I mean, I wasn't necessarily expecting 5 touchdowns, but it was one of those things to where he's getting Will Fuller back, somebody who I said was good to stash last week. I was a little apprehensive to start him because I wasn't sure how he was going to work in an offense, but I did have high hopes that he would come in, take the pressure off of Hopkins, give Watson another target, and lo and behold, it turns out that Watson has been basically working with Fuller during his rehab process. They've developed a rapport. 2 touchdowns later, I'm really hyped on Fuller going forward.
All right, moving on. Let's give people a hint, a little preview of your start and sit column that will drop 11 a.m. Pacific time Thursday on the Union-Tribune website. Brought up the 2 quarterbacks who last week you gave a very prescient, prophetic preview, said to start them. This week, based on the matchup that we've already discussed, and also what his team will need to do, you're saying start Jameis Winston.
Yeah, at this point, I think it's fair. We talked about giving Belichick the benefit of doubt. Well, I think that time's over. I think it's fair if you're a fantasy owner to start targeting the Patriots defense.
And then add in the fact the Buccaneers playing the Patriots, that you figure the Patriots are going to score, so that means Jameis Winston's got to be flinging it.
He has to. I mean, they're not going to play ball control offense against the Patriots offense that's capable of putting up 30 points. Plus, their defense isn't that special.
Their defense isn't special, which is why you say this is one of your games to go with, because you say if you are a skill position player on the Patriots offense, start them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you read my column tomorrow, you're going to see it's almost like I'm listing the rosters of the Patriots and the Buccaneers. It's one of those things to where I think, like I said, going forward, you're going to target the Patriots. And this week, there's a lot of good skill players to do it.
Question on Facebook Live. Jared Goff, is he a starter in fantasy football yet?
Not yet.
Now, I think last week you mentioned that you were still watching him. Maybe,
yeah,
but
he has a tough. I mean, he played well last week, which was the first leg of like a string of 4 games.
Right.
That I
so
think
like
are really
after
tough.
he tore apart the 49ers, you said, "Oh boy, watch what the Rams who the Rams are playing."
Right.
He got through that one.
And so now I'm like, okay, streaming option. He's graduated. He's graduated from like this year. He's been from bust to he's serviceable to maybe he could be a QB2 to now he's a streaming option if you're desperate, if you're having trouble with bad matchup or something like that. If he makes it through these next 3 weeks before their bye, all against tough defenses, then yeah, we can say fantasy starter going forward.
Eddie, let's close on this here because you fascinate me the way that your mind works. Earlier, you're talking about Cam Newton. He's off of the garbage heap for you.
Yes.
Now you say sit him. Tyreek Hill, fantasy stud. But this shows you're a thinking man. You are constantly tweaking. You say sit Tyreek Hill, the Chiefs wide receiver. So let's hit Cam Newton first.
Well, so yeah, he's off the trash heap, but tough matchup on the road against the Lions defense that I think a lot of people are sleeping on, not just in fantasy, but in real life. You're talking about a defense that's essentially shut down their first 4 opponents. And they're at home, which they're a better team historically at home regardless. So yes, I'm not afraid to roll with Newton going forward. I'm not going to drop him going forward. But this week, if you have another option, you might want to consider that because the Lions defense is for real and they're playing at home.
Another option, like...
Well, I mean...
Who do Cam Newton owners have?
They might have Jared Goff. So if you
okay.
Like I said, he's a streaming option. Okay. You might have...
Phillip Rivers against the Giants.
Phillip Rivers against the Giants. You might have Eli Manning.
Might have Eli Manning against the Chargers.
You might have Eli Manning against the Chargers. You might, there's a lot of solid matchups that guys that they're not necessarily elite receivers out there.
And then Tyreek Hill, a danger at any time, and you say not this week against the Lions.
Against the Texans.
The Texans. Yeah. I apologize.
No, Tyreek Hill is the whole thing about him is he's a boom or bust player. I mean, he can go off at any time, and it wouldn't shock me if we're sitting here next week and we're talking about Tyreek Hill had those 3 touchdowns. But the Houston defense is playing significantly better. They've had one hiccup, and that was against the Patriots. That's okay. But the other 3 times they've been pretty dominant, which we expected them to be.
Week 1 against the Jags after the first game after the hurricane, not great. You know how I know that, Eddie? They got me 2 points.
Because you got these 2 points. Yeah. Well, as a real defense,
talk about dehumanizing.
Yeah.
It was a whole hurricane thing, and J.J. Watt raised like $20 million. But damn it!
Well, I actually had them in a survivor pool too, based on the idea that they're playing for the hurricane. It doesn't work out that way sometimes.
We've been dehumanized.
We have been dehumanized. But I think that going forward, the Texans are a good enough defense to where they can say, "Hey, we need to take this guy out of the offense and force Alex Smith to throw to Kelsey or throw to Kareem Hunt or run the ball or whatever." And it's at Houston. I'm skeptical when my players go on the road.
Eddie Brown, give him the Twitter one more time.
UT Eddie Brown.
UT Eddie Brown. We'll be back next week. America's finest fantasy football podcast. It's getting too easy now. It's not even a tongue twister anymore.
It's very skilled.
Well, there's that too, skill.